In the heart of a brutal winter, Samuel Grant, a reclusive writer, believed he had lost all purpose, until fate led a wounded grizzly bear and her 3 cubs to his doorstep. What began as an act of kindness turned into an inspiring story of trust, resilience, and unexpected companionship. As the storm raged outside, Samuel and the bears shared the warmth of his cabin, forming a bond that would change them both forever. Through each passing day, the man who had once embraced solitude found himself rediscovering connection, purpose, and hope. But when the snow finally settled, it was time for Luna and her cubs to return to the wild, leaving Samuel with a newfound appreciation for life's fragile yet beautiful moments. This inspiring story reminds us that healing comes in the most unexpected ways, and that even the coldest winters cannot last forever. If you've ever felt lost, alone, or in search of meaning, this inspiring story will touch your heart in ways you never expected. Listen to the full video and experience the depth of this inspiring story, one that proves even in life's darkest storms, the warmth of connection can guide us home. The wind howled through the towering pines of the Cascade Mountains, rattling the single-pane windows of the remote cabin nestled deep within the wilderness. Outside, the world was a frozen expanse of white, the snow piled high against the trees, muffling every sound except for the relentless storm. Inside, Samuel Grant sat at his desk, hunched over a stack of yellowed pages, his pen motionless in his hand. The wood-burning stove crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the log walls. But its warmth did little to thaw the chill that had settled in his bones over the past year. A framed photograph sat beside him, its silver edges dulled with age. The woman in the picture, Eleanor, smiled at him with a warmth he could no longer feel. He ran his fingers over the glass, a habit he hadn't broken, though he told himself he should. It was supposed to get easier, wasn't it? But grief had a way of settling in like the winter snow, silent, suffocating, and unwilling to melt. Then, through the howl of the storm, a sound reached him, a noise so foreign, so out of place, that it made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't the groan of tree limbs straining under the weight of ice, nor the distant cry of an owl. It was something else, something alive. Samuel sat up, his breath held tight in his chest. There it was again, a deep, mournful wail, carried on the wind like a ghost's lament. His pulse quickened. It was too guttural to be human, too sorrowful to be anything he had ever heard in these woods before. He grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and hesitated for only a second before pulling on his heavy coat and stepping outside. The cold hit him like a hammer, stealing his breath as he scanned the darkness. Snowflakes swirled around him, the beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the storm. The sound came again, closer now, a deep, ragged moan that sent a shiver through his spine. Then he saw it. At the edge of his porch, just beyond the dim glow of the cabin's light, stood a massive shape. His heart pounded as he aimed the flashlight forward, illuminating a thick coat of snow-dappled fur, broad shoulders, and dark, glistening eyes. A grizzly. Samuel's instincts screamed at him to retreat, to get inside, to lock the door. But he didn't. Because despite everything he knew about these creatures, about their power, their unpredictability, he felt no fear. The bear wasn't charging, it wasn't growling, it was pleading. And as Samuel's gaze dropped, his breath caught. Blood, dark and fresh, spilled across the snow from its front leg. The bear let out another broken sound, its body swaying from exhaustion. Samuel tightened his grip on the flashlight. This wasn't just a wild animal, this was something else. Something desperate, something lost. And for the first time in a long, long while, so was he. Samuel Grant had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that helping a wounded animal, let alone a grizzly bear, was a dangerous idea. He should have turned back, locked the door, and let nature take its course. That was the rule out here. The wild had its own order, and humans meddling in it rarely led to anything good. But as he stood there, staring into the bear's dark, pain-filled eyes, The part of him that had once cared, once felt something, stirred. The bear swayed slightly, its massive frame shifting in the snow. Its breathing was ragged, labored. The blood pooling at its feet was dark against the pure white, staining the ground like spilled ink. The wound was deep, fresh, likely from a fight with another predator. If left untreated, infection and the cold would do what the claws of its attacker hadn't. Samuel exhaled slowly, his breath a cloud in the frigid air. "This is a bad idea," he muttered, more to himself than anything else. The bear let out a low, guttural moan. Not a growl, not a warning, but something closer to exhaustion. It wasn't a creature looking for a fight. It was a mother on the brink, desperate and barely holding on. Samuel knew that feeling all too well. His fingers tightened around the flashlight as he took a slow step backward. The bear didn't move, only watched him, its massive head slightly lowered as if waiting. "All right," he murmured. "Don't do anything stupid, and neither will I." Keeping his movements deliberate, Samuel turned and stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. He pulled the cabin door open and stepped inside, closing it behind him with a soft click. He stood there for a moment, gripping the doorknob, listening. The bear didn't leave. He wasn't sure what that meant. His hands moved on instinct, pulling open cabinets, searching through drawers. He hadn't stocked medical supplies for treating bears, but he had the basics: bandages, antiseptic, an old first aid manual he hadn't touched in years. He stuffed everything into a canvas bag, along with a thick wool blanket and a thermos of warm water. He had no idea if a bear would drink from a thermos, but it was better than nothing. As an afterthought, he grabbed a strip of dried meat from his pantry. When he opened the door again, the cold rushed in, biting at his skin. The bear was still there, standing in the same spot. Snowflakes clung to its fur, melting into damp patches that glistened in the dim porch light. Samuel took a slow, measured step forward. The bear's ears twitched, its muscles stiffening, but it didn't back away. "That's good," he said quietly. "Let's keep it that way." He crouched down a few feet away, setting the bag on the snow. His fingers were already numb as he unscrewed the thermos and poured a small stream of water onto his palm, then held it out. The bear sniffed the air but didn't move closer. "All right, maybe later," Samuel muttered, setting the thermos down. Now came the hard part. He shifted his focus to the bear's wounded leg. Blood matted the thick fur around the injury, seeping into the snow. Closer now, he could see the deep gashes running across the paw and up the forearm. Claw marks. "Looks like you had yourself a fight," he murmured. "And you lost." He reached into the bag and pulled out the antiseptic. "This is gonna sting." The first splash of peroxide hit the wound, and the bear let out a sharp, snarling huff, jerking slightly to the side. Samuel instinctively shot backward, his pulse hammering. He knew this was a risk. He knew that if the bear decided in this moment that she had had enough, he wouldn't make it back to the cabin. But the bear didn't attack. She let out a low, pained groan, but she didn't lunge. Samuel took that as permission to keep going. It was slow work. His fingers were stiff, the cold biting at his skin, and he had to keep pausing to warm them against his coat. But eventually he managed to clean the wound and wrap it in a strip of gauze. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Satisfied, he sat back on his heels, studying his work. "That's the best I can do," he told her. "You're on your own for the rest." The bear watched him, her dark eyes unreadable. Then, to his astonishment, she did something he hadn't expected. She lowered her head. Not in pain, not in exhaustion. In acknowledgement. Samuel swallowed, an unfamiliar tightness forming in his chest. "You're welcome," he murmured. He reached for the wool blanket, unfolding it carefully before draping it over the bear's back. He had no idea if it would help, but it felt like the right thing to do. The bear didn't shake it off. Samuel exhaled, finally letting himself lean back in the snow. His muscles ached from the tension of the last hour, but he hadn't realized just how much until now. The wind howled through the trees, but the world between them was silent. After a long moment, the bear turned. For a split second, he thought she might leave, but instead she took a few slow steps away, then paused, looking back at him. There was something in her gaze, something deep, something knowing. Then she disappeared into the trees. Samuel sat there, watching the darkness swallow her. The snow fell heavier now, settling around him, but for the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel numb. He had done something that mattered. As he pushed himself to his feet and made his way back to the cabin, he found himself hoping, really hoping, that this wouldn't be the last time he saw her. Morning came slowly to the Cascade Mountains, the pale winter sun struggling to break through the thick cloud cover. Samuel Grant sat by his window, cradling a steaming mug of coffee in his weathered hands. His cabin was warm, the wood stove still crackling with embers from the night before, but a different kind of warmth settled inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in a long time. The events of the previous night played over in his mind. The wounded bear, the way she had stood there, trusting him enough to let him treat her injury, and then that moment before she disappeared into the woods. Her gaze, deep and knowing, lingering on him, as if she understood more than just survival. He had done his best for her. That should have been enough. And yet, as he stared at the snow-covered clearing beyond his porch, he felt something gnawing at him, a sense of unease, a question left unanswered. Was she all right? With a quiet sigh, Samuel set his mug down and reached for his heavy coat. He wasn't planning to play nursemaid to a wild bear, but something told him this wasn't just a random encounter. There was something more to this. He pulled on his boots, tucked a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a few protein bars into his jacket, and stepped out into the morning cold. The snow crunched beneath his feet as he followed the faint trail of blood leading away from his cabin. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Samuel kept his ears sharp, his senses on high alert. He didn't know what he expected to find. Maybe the bear curled up in a thicket licking her wounds. Maybe nothing at all. But after nearly half an hour of trudging through the deep snow, he saw it. A large cedar tree, its roots forming a hollow beneath its trunk, protected from the worst of the elements. Snow had piled high around it, but something had disturbed the ground. A space where the snow was packed down, where something large had been lying. Samuel's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the snow, and that's when he saw them. 3 small trembling shapes, barely visible beneath a thin blanket of white. Cubs? His breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a hammer. The bear, Luna as he found himself calling her in his mind, hadn't just been fighting for herself, she had been fighting for them. The cubs were huddled together, pressed tightly against each other for warmth. Their fur was a patchwork of brown and cream, their tiny bodies barely larger than house cats. One of them, a bold little thing with a streak of lighter fur across its nose, shifted slightly, its small face peeking out from the safety of its siblings. Samuel knelt down, moving slowly, carefully. He could hear their tiny breaths, see the way their small chests rose and fell. They were alive, but they were cold. Too cold. And their mother wasn't here. His stomach twisted. Where was she? He scanned the surrounding woods, his eyes sweeping through the trees, but there was no sign of her. No fresh tracks, no movement. The snow-covered landscape was still, eerily silent. A deep frown settled on his face. Had she left them here to rest while she searched for food? Or had something happened to her? Samuel clenched his jaw, pushing the thought aside. He needed to focus on what was in front of him. He shrugged off his coat and carefully draped it over the cubs, tucking the edges around them as best he could. They didn't stir, too weak to react, but he could feel the faint warmth of their small bodies beneath his fingertips. They wouldn't survive out here much longer. His mind raced, weighing his options. He could leave them here and hope Luna returned, but if she was hurt, or worse, if she couldn't come back, these cubs wouldn't last the night. He could try to move them to his cabin, but that was risky. If Luna returned and found them gone, she'd tear the forest apart looking for them. And then, as if on cue, a sound shattered the silence. A low, rumbling growl. Samuel stiffened. Slowly he turned his head. And there, emerging from the trees, was her, Luna. She was moving slowly, her injured legs still stiff, her breath heavy with exhaustion, but there was no mistaking the sharp awareness in her eyes, the way her ears flicked forward, the tension in her powerful shoulders as she took in the sight before her. Her cubs curled beneath his coat. Samuel stayed still. The moment stretched, long and taut as a drawn bowstring. Then Luna let out a soft, breathy huff. A sound Samuel didn't fully understand, but one that made something inside him loosen just slightly. He lifted his hands in a slow, measured movement, as if to show he wasn't a threat. "They're all right," he murmured. "They're cold, but they're all right." Luna stepped forward, closing the distance between them with careful, deliberate movements. When she reached the hollow, she lowered her massive head, sniffing at the cubs. One of them, the bald one, let out a tiny, pitiful squeak, wriggling closer to her. Samuel exhaled, finally allowing his muscles to relax. She had come back. Despite her wounds, despite her exhaustion, she had come back for them. He didn't know why that settled so deep in his chest, why it made his throat tighten. But it did. Samuel hesitated, then slowly reached out and pulled the coat away, letting the cubs press into their mother's warm fur. "You did good," he murmured. "You kept them safe." Luna lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting his. For a moment there was nothing between them but silence. And then, with the softest of movements, she lowered herself into the hollow, curling protectively around her cubs. Samuel watched as the little ones nuzzled into her, their tiny bodies disappearing beneath the safety of her thick fur. He let out a slow breath. He should go. He should. But instead he found himself sinking down onto a nearby log, watching over them as the snowfall thickened around them, his heart beating with something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Something like purpose. Something like hope. Samuel Grant was no stranger to solitude. He had lived with it, breathed it, let it settle into his bones like the cold of a long winter. But for the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be alone anymore. As he sat on the old log near Luna's makeshift den, watching the bear and her cubs huddled together, something inside him stirred. The scene before him was almost surreal. This massive grizzly, a creature that should have been nothing but wild instinct and raw power, nestled protectively around her tiny cubs. And yet, there was more to it than that. There was trust. A trust that neither of them had asked for but had somehow fallen into, as if the forest itself had conspired to pull them into each other's paths. The snow fell lightly now, the storm having passed, leaving the world blanketed in quiet. Samuel adjusted his coat, shaking off the damp cold that clung to him, and exhaled, his breath clouding the air. He should go back to his cabin, warm up, maybe even try to get some rest. But he didn't move. Not yet. Luna lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes flickering toward him. She didn't growl, didn't shift in warning, just watch. Samuel took that as a sign. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the protein bars he had brought. He unwrapped it, breaking off a piece before setting it down on the snow near the den. "I know this isn't exactly fresh salmon, but it's all I've got," he murmured. Luna's nose twitched as she sniffed the air, but she didn't move toward it. Instead, one of the cubs, the bold one, wriggled forward, tiny paws pressing into the snow as it hesitantly sniffed the food. Samuel held his breath. The cub looked back at its mother as if waiting for permission. When Luna didn't react, the little one took an awkward bite, chewing with exaggerated, clumsy movements. Samuel chuckled softly. "Not bad, huh?" he said, voice low and even. The cub blinked at him, nose twitching, before retreating back into the safety of its mother's fur. It wasn't much, but it was something. Samuel leaned back, stretching out his stiff legs. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, watching the family, but time moved differently in the wilderness. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like moments. At some point, Luna closed her eyes, her breathing deep and steady. The cubs followed soon after, their tiny bodies rising and falling in sync with hers. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They trusted him enough to sleep. That meant something. The days that followed felt different. Samuel woke each morning with a new sense of purpose, something that had been missing for far too long. He prepared carefully before heading back into the woods, packing extra food, water, and whatever supplies he thought might help. Every morning he found himself drawn back to the hollow beneath the cedar tree. And every morning Luna was there. She still watched him with careful eyes, her instincts never fully resting, but the tension in her posture had softened. The first few days she remained mostly still, conserving her energy, allowing her body to heal. But by the fourth morning he noticed a change. She was more alert, more aware. And the cubs, Cedar, Aspen, and Birch, as he had taken to calling them, were getting bolder. They still stuck close to their mother, but now, when Samuel arrived, they didn't just hide in her fur. They watched him. Cedar, the smallest and most fearless, was the first to venture forward, sniffing curiously at the snow-covered ground near Samuel's boots. The little cub let out a soft, high-pitched huff, a tiny sound, barely audible, but it made Samuel grin. "Well, looks like someone's warming up to me," he murmured. Birch, the largest of the three, was more cautious. He stayed close to Luna, peering at Samuel with wide, curious eyes, but never venturing too far. Aspen, the middle cube, was somewhere in between, sometimes brave, sometimes hesitant, as if constantly debating whether to follow Cedar's lead or Birch's caution. Samuel watched them, fascinated by their personalities, by how different they all were despite sharing the same blood, the same mother. They were alive, vulnerable yet resilient, and against all odds, they had let him into their world. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Samuel sat by the hollow, hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. Luna shifted, her injured leg moving more fluidly now. She was healing, slowly but surely. "You'll be back to full strength soon," he mused aloud. "Not that you ever really let it slow you down." Luna let out a quiet breath through her nose, her gaze steady. Samuel didn't know why he kept talking to her. Maybe because she was the first living soul in a long time who listened without judgment. Maybe because, in some strange way, she understood. The cubs were playing now, tumbling over one another in clumsy bursts of energy, their small paws kicking up flurries of snow. Cedar, as expected, was the first to venture toward Samuel again. The little cub sniffed at his boots, then at his outstretched hand. Samuel remained perfectly still. Then, with surprising boldness, Cedar pressed his tiny nose against Samuel's fingers. It was a fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a warmth through Samuel's chest, something real, something unexpected. The cub blinked up at him, let out another tiny huff, then scampered back to its siblings. Samuel exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You're gonna be trouble," he muttered fondly. Luna watched the interaction, her dark eyes unreadable, but she didn't seem concerned. In fact, for the first time since they had met, she almost looked at ease. Samuel leaned back against the log, letting himself relax for the first time in a long while. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of branches, the distant call of a bird, and the soft breaths of the bears beside him. For the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel alone. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. The first warning came with the wind. Samuel Grant stood outside his cabin, the axe in his hands biting into the thick log beneath it. He had spent the afternoon splitting firewood, stacking it high against the outer wall of the cabin, but now he paused. The wind had shifted. It was sharper now, colder. It carried a different weight, a different presence. He glanced up at the sky. Heavy gray clouds had gathered on the horizon, rolling in like an army preparing for war. The distant mountains were already swallowed by the storm, their peaks disappearing beneath an advancing wall of white. A blizzard was coming. Samuel cursed under his breath. He had seen storms like this before, fast-moving, brutal, and completely unforgiving. He had survived them, but Luna and the cubs? That was another story. Without hesitation, he tossed the axe aside, grabbed his coat, and headed into the cabin. His mind was already working through the supplies he had: blankets, extra food, whatever he could carry. He moved quickly, stuffing essentials into a canvas bag. Then, without another thought, he stepped back out into the cold and started toward the hollow. The forest was already shifting under the storm's approach. The wind howled through the trees, bending their massive trunks like they were nothing more than twigs. Snowflakes lashed at his face, cutting through his coat as he pushed forward. Each step became more difficult, the already deep snow swallowing his boots as he trudged toward Luna's den. It felt farther today. He tightened his grip on the canvas bag, ignoring the sting in his fingers. He didn't have time to think about the cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the base of the cedar tree. Luna was there, curled around her cubs, but she was restless. She lifted her head as soon as he arrived, her dark eyes sharp, alert. She knew something was wrong. "You feel it too, huh?" Samuel muttered, brushing snow from his face. The cubs were pressed tightly against their mother, barely moving. Even Cedar, the boldest of the three, was unusually still. They were bracing for the storm. Samuel dropped to one knee, unfastening the bag. He pulled out a thick wool blanket, carefully shaking off the snow before draping it over the cubs. He knew it wouldn't do much against the coming blizzard, but it was better than nothing. Then he looked at Luna. "We can't stay here," he said, though he knew she didn't understand the words. Not this time. She watched him, unblinking. He gestured toward the path leading back to the cabin. "You have to come with me." Luna let out a low, cautious breath. Samuel knew this was a risk. Every instinct in her body told her to stay here, to shelter in place, to protect her cubs by keeping them hidden. But this wasn't just another snowfall. This was something worse. And if they stayed out here, she wouldn't be able to protect them from the cold. Samuel shifted, sitting back on his heels. "I know you don't trust me completely," he murmured, voice steady, "but you have to, just this once." The wind howled, a deafening roar ripping through the trees. The first true gusts of the storm slammed into them, shaking the branches overhead, sending a flurry of snow cascading down around them. Luna flinched, her ears flattening. Samuel's breath came in short, frozen bursts. Then, finally, Luna moved. She shifted her massive body, nudging her cubs gently, coaxing them to their feet. They whined in protest, clumsy and sluggish from the cold, but she was firm. She made her decision. Samuel exhaled, relief washing over him, but he didn't let himself relax. "Come on," he urged, standing. He turned and started back toward the cabin, his steps careful, slow. He didn't look back. Not yet. He needed her to follow on her own. And then, behind him, he heard it. The soft crunch of snow beneath massive paws. She was coming. The journey back was brutal. The wind was relentless, tearing through the forest like a living thing, shrieking between the trees. The snowfall had thickened, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Samuel kept his head down, focusing on each step, on keeping his balance. Behind him, he could hear Luna's heavy footfalls, the sound of her cubs scrambling to keep up. A few times he had to stop, turn back and clear a path for them when the snow piled too high. Luna didn't like that. He could see the tension in her body each time he got close. But she let him help. Somewhere along the way, Cedar stumbled. The little cub let out a high-pitched whimper, its tiny paws sinking deep into the snow. Samuel was moving before he even thought about it. He reached down, carefully scooping the cub into his arms. It was small but solid, its fur already dusted with frost. Cedar wriggled at first, startled, but then settled against his chest, shivering. Luna let out a low warning sound, stepping closer. Samuel met her gaze. "I'm just helping," he told her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Luna huffed and looked away. Samuel tightened his hold on the cub and kept moving. Step by step, foot by foot, they pushed forward through the storm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cabin came into view. The small wooden structure was already half buried in snow, but to Samuel it looked like salvation. He reached the porch first, shouldering open the door, letting the warm air rush out into the bitter cold. Then he turned back. Luna hesitated at the base of the steps. The cubs, still clinging to her legs, were trembling from exhaustion. Samuel took a slow breath. "It's safe," he said. "Come on." For a second he thought she wouldn't do it. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Luna stepped forward. The porch creaked under her weight as she climbed up, her cubs stumbling behind her. Samuel stepped aside as she passed through the doorway, her massive frame barely fitting inside. The cubs tumbled in after her, pressing close against her legs. Then Samuel shut the door, sealing out the storm. Silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, the soft whimpering of the cubs as they huddled into the blankets. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had made it. He turned to Luna, who was already lowering herself onto the blankets, her cubs piling around her. Their eyes met, and for the first time, he saw something new in her gaze. Not just caution, not just survival, something closer to understanding. Samuel nodded once. "You're safe now," he murmured. Then, for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe it too. The storm raged outside, howling through the trees, battering the cabin with unrelenting gusts of wind. Snow piled against the windows, cutting off what little light the day had left. But inside, the fire crackled steadily, casting warm flickers of orange and gold across the wooden walls. Samuel Grant stood by the stove, watching as the embers glowed beneath a fresh log. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, a welcome contrast to the biting cold they had just escaped. Behind him he could hear them. Luna and her cubs? It was a reality he still hadn't quite processed, sharing his small, secluded home with a full-grown grizzly and 3 tiny cubs. But there they were, settled in the far corner of the room, curled up on the thick blankets he had laid down for them. Luna's massive form was stretched across the floor, her cubs nestled tightly against her belly, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. For a while they had been restless, uncertain. The cubs had whined, shuffling about as they tried to understand this new space. But now exhaustion had taken over. Even Cedar, the boldest of the 3, had finally drifted into a deep, twitching sleep. Samuel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "What the hell am I doing?" he muttered to himself. This wasn't normal, not by any stretch of the imagination. A bear in his cabin, 3 cubs on his blankets. He should have been terrified. He should have been questioning his own sanity. And yet, he wasn't. If anything, the sight of them, the steady rhythm of their breathing, the warmth radiating from their small bodies, was strangely comforting. For the first time in months, his cabin didn't feel empty. The first few hours were tense. Luna was still watching him, her dark eyes following his every movement. She wasn't aggressive. There were no warning growls, no signs of unease. But she was cautious. Samuel respected that. He moved slowly, deliberately, making sure not to startle her. He stayed on his side of the cabin, giving her space while he prepared food. It wasn't much. His supplies were running low. He had been putting off a trip to town for too long, but he had enough to get through the storm. He boiled water, making himself coffee, then dug through the pantry for something he could offer the bears. He found an old bag of dried fish, a little stale but still edible. He hesitated before pulling out a few pieces. "This probably isn't what you're used to," he muttered, breaking off a strip and setting it on the floor near Luna. "But it's all I've got." Luna sniffed the air but didn't move right away. Her ears twitched, assessing. Then, finally, she shifted forward, stretching her thick neck toward the offering. She took it between her powerful jaws, chewing slowly. Samuel let out a quiet breath. The cubs stirred at the smell of food, their tiny noses twitching. One by one they wriggled forward, Cedar leading the charge as always. Samuel chuckled. "Figured you'd be the first," he said under his breath. Cedar pawed at the dried fish, sniffing it curiously before taking an awkward bite. The other two followed, their small jaws working as they gnawed at the unfamiliar meal. Samuel leaned against the counter, watching. It was strange, this moment of quiet. He had spent the past year drowning in silence, his kind of silence. The kind that settled into the bones, that made a home in the empty spaces where laughter and conversation used to be. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but suffocating. Now the silence wasn't so heavy. The soft shuffling of the cubs, the rhythmic sound of Luna's breathing, the occasional crackle of the fire, these sounds filled the cabin in a way he hadn't realized he needed. Samuel took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth. For the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel alone. As the hours passed, a new rhythm formed. The storm showed no signs of slowing, so Samuel busied himself with small tasks, splitting more firewood, rearranging supplies, keeping his hands moving so his thoughts wouldn't wander too far. Luna dozed for the most part, conserving her energy, but the cubs were growing more active. By late afternoon, they had begun exploring the cabin in cautious, clumsy steps. Cedar naturally was the first to wander. He waddled away from Luna's warmth, his small paws padding across the wooden floor, sniffing at the air. Samuel watched him, amused. "Getting comfortable, huh?" he said. Cedar turned toward him, blinking. Then, with surprising boldness, the little cub toddled closer, his tiny nose wrinkling as he sniffed at Samuel's boot. Samuel held still, his breath catching slightly. Then Cedar did something that completely caught him off guard. He pressed his small forehead against Samuel's shin, just for a second, before retreating back to his siblings. Samuel let out a quiet, stunned laugh. "Well," he murmured, shaking his head, "I guess that's a start." Luna watched the exchange, her dark eyes steady. She didn't move, didn't react, just observe. Samuel wasn't sure if she approved, but she didn't seem to disapprove either. By nightfall, the storm was still howling outside, but inside the cabin, warmth had settled in. The cubs had worn themselves out with their brief exploration, now piled together in a sleepy heap. Samuel sat by the fire, his notebook open on the table. For the first time in months, the words came easily. He wrote about the storm, about Luna, about the cubs and their cautious, curious movements. He wrote about the silence, not the empty, aching kind, but the kind that felt full, the kind that felt alive. He wasn't sure where this was all going. He didn't know what would happen when the storm passed, when Luna was strong enough to leave. But for now, this was enough. For now, he let himself breathe. As he closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, he glanced toward Luna one last time. She was watching him again, but this time her gaze was softer. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him too. The storm had finally passed. Samuel Grant stood on the porch, staring out at the world that had been reshaped by winter's fury. The forest was nearly unrecognizable beneath the heavy snowdrifts, the trees sagging under thick layers of white. The sky, once dark and ominous, had given way to a soft, pale blue. Sunlight glistened on the ice, casting long shadows across the landscape. It was quiet, peaceful. Inside, the cabin no longer felt like just his. Luna and the cubs had made it their temporary home, adapting to the space as if they had always belonged. Over the past few days, a strange sense of normalcy had settled between them. Samuel had grown used to waking up to the soft sounds of the cubs stirring, to the quiet weight of Luna's presence in the room. But now the snow had settled, the winds had died down, and Luna knew. Samuel had seen the shift in her that morning, the restlessness, the way she had begun pacing by the door, sniffing at the air, the way her ears flicked at every sound outside, her instincts calling her back to the wild. She was ready. He had known this moment would come. It didn't make it any easier. Samuel stepped back inside, letting the warmth of the fire wash over him. Luna was already on her feet, her massive frame stretching as she moved toward the door. The cubs were still curled in their pile of blankets, but they were stirring now, sensing the change in their mother. Samuel knelt down, watching as Cedar yawned, his tiny mouth stretching wide before he blinked up at him. "Looks like it's time," Samuel murmured. Cedar let out a small huff, tilting his head. Samuel reached out carefully, brushing a hand over the cub's fur. He had grown used to their presence, their warmth. He had grown used to them. Luna made a low, rumbling sound, a quiet call to her cubs. They scrambled to their feet, clumsy and still groggy, but they obeyed. They always did. Samuel stood and moved to the door, resting a hand on the knob. He hesitated. Then he turned, looking at Luna one last time. She met his gaze, her dark eyes steady. This wasn't like before. The first time she had looked at him, she had been wary, guarded, but now there was something else there, something closer to understanding. Samuel swallowed, his throat tight. "You'll be all right out there?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. Luna exhaled through her nose, a soft, almost reassuring sound. Samuel huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, I figured." He pushed the door open. The cold rushed in, crisp and sharp. Snowflakes swirled in the light wind, the air filled with the scent of pine and ice. Luna didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her paws sinking into the fresh snow. The cubs followed close behind, their tiny bodies leaving delicate imprints in her wake. Samuel stood there watching as they moved toward the tree line. With each step, something inside him ached. They belonged out there. He knew that. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt to watch them go. Luna paused at the edge of the clearing. For a moment she simply stood there, the wind ruffling her thick fur. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Their eyes met one last time. Samuel felt something catch in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe nothing. But then, to his quiet astonishment, Luna did something he never could have predicted. She dipped her head. A small, deliberate movement. A gesture of acknowledgement. Of gratitude. Samuel swallowed hard. He raised a hand, barely lifting it from his side, a silent farewell. "Take care of them," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "and yourself." Luna lingered for a breath longer. Then, with a final exhale, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her cubs scrambling to keep up. The forest swallowed them whole. And just like that, they were gone. Samuel didn't move. He stood there, staring at the place where they had vanished, the cold biting at his skin. He had known this would happen, had told himself from the start that this was temporary, but damn if it didn't feel like something had just been torn from him. His cabin was his again, his alone again. He let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face before stepping back inside. The silence pressed in almost immediately. It wasn't like before, though. It wasn't suffocating. It was just quiet. Samuel moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames. His hand rested on the back of his chair, fingers gripping the worn wood. The cabin still smelled like them, like the wild, like warmth, like something alive. His gaze drifted to the blankets where the cubs had once slept. The small indentations were still there, the fabric rumpled and warm. He closed his eyes. And then, for the first time in a long time, he smiled. That night, Samuel sat at his desk, the notebook open in front of him. The words came easily. He wrote about the storm, about the hollow beneath the cedar tree, about the night he had sat in the snow, watching over a mother bear and her cubs. He wrote about trust, about how sometimes the most unexpected bonds are the ones that change us the most. About how, in the heart of winter, surrounded by ice and silence, he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. And as he wrote, the fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and the cabin, though empty, didn't feel quite so alone anymore. Samuel Grant had spent the last year drowning in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, suffocating kind. The kind that filled the spaces where laughter once lived. The kind that wrapped around a man's chest and squeezed until there was nothing left but hollow breaths and old memories. But this morning, as he stepped outside his cabin, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full. The snow-covered landscape stretched before him, the trees shimmering under the golden light of the rising sun. The world had been reborn under a thick, icy blanket, but the cold no longer felt so bitter. The storm had passed, and so had something else. Something inside him. Samuel let out a slow breath, watching it curl in the air. He turned his gaze toward the tree line, his eyes instinctively searching. They were gone, he knew that. But still, he looked. A part of him had hoped, just maybe, that he would catch one last glimpse of them, of her, of the tiny paw prints in the snow, of Cedar's bold, clumsy steps trailing after his siblings. But the forest had swallowed them, as it was always meant to. He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. It was better this way. They had their home. And, strangely enough, he had his. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like running from it. The day passed in slow, measured moments. Samuel went about his usual routine, chopping firewood, checking his supplies, shoveling the snow off the front porch, tasks he had done 1,000 times before. But today, they felt different, lighter, like they belonged to a life worth living again. By midday, he found himself standing by the old path that led into town. He hadn't been in weeks, maybe longer. For a while, it had felt like there was no reason to go. What did he need? He had enough supplies to scrape by, and besides, people asked too many questions. How have you been, Sam? How are you holding up? Questions he hadn't wanted to answer. But now he thought maybe he wouldn't mind so much. Maybe he'd stop by the general store, talk to Martha, the kind old woman who always asked about him even when he never gave her much in return. Maybe he'd sit at the cafe and have a hot meal that wasn't made on a wood stove. Maybe he was ready for that. He took a deep breath and turned away from the path. Not yet, but soon. That night the cabin was warm. Samuel sat by the fire, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, his notebook open on the table in front of him. He had filled more pages in the past few days than he had in months. The words came easily now, spilling from his pen like an old friend. He wrote about Luna, about the storm, about the moment she had met his gaze before vanishing into the trees. He wrote about how the forest had given him something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A reason to care again. A reason to wake up in the morning and feel alive. He glanced at the empty space near the fire, the spot where Luna had once curled up, the cubs nestled safely against her. For the first time, the emptiness didn't hurt. It just was. Samuel smiled softly, tapping his pen against the edge of the notebook. Then, with quiet certainty, he wrote the last line of his story. And so, in the heart of winter, as the storm raged and the world seemed frozen in time, a man and a bear crossed paths. Not as predator and prey, not as something to be feared, but as something far rarer, as something almost like family. He set down his pen, staring at the words for a long time. Then, with a slow breath, he closed the notebook. Tomorrow he would go into town. Tomorrow he would take a step forward. Tomorrow life would begin again. And for the first time in a long time, that thought didn't scare him. It felt like hope. Life has a way of surprising us even in our darkest moments. Samuel Grant believed he was destined to live in solitude, carrying the weight of grief that seemed too heavy to set down. But when an unexpected bond formed between him and a mother bear seeking shelter, something shifted. His story reminds us that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's found in the quiet moments, the warmth of shared space, the trust built between strangers, and the realization that we are never truly alone. Luna and her cubs didn't just survive the storm, they reminded Samuel that he could too. For many of us, especially as we grow older, loneliness can feel like an inescapable reality. But just like Samuel, we are capable of rediscovering purpose, connection, and even joy. Whether it's through old friendships rekindled, new bonds formed, or simply choosing to step outside and embrace life once more, there is always a path forward. Even in the heart of winter, spring will come, and when it does, we must be ready to welcome it. Samuel's journey shows us that even in the deepest solitude, life has a way of pulling us back, reminding us that we are never truly alone. Through trust, resilience, and unexpected companionship, he found his way forward, and so can we. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more powerful tales of friendship, loyalty, and healing.